Welcome to the Future Knowledge Podcast and our special summer series on vanishing culture, brought to you by me, Vida, and the Internet Archive. We're talking with the archivists, librarians, and creators fighting to preserve our shared cultural history.
Hey listeners, I'm Dave Hansen.
And I'm Chris Freeland. This is Future Knowledge.
A note as we start up. We're sharing a special 6-part weekly series called Vanishing Culture, exploring what's at risk of being lost in the digital age and why preservation matters.
The series is inspired by Vanishing Culture, the new book from the Internet Archive. You can read it online for free at archive.org or find it in print at your favorite bookstore.
And now, on with today's episode. Vida, listeners have spent 5 episodes hearing you learn alongside them. And before this project, what did vanishing culture mean to you and how has your understanding changed?
Well, I would say that vanishing culture wasn't really a term that I was familiar with prior to this project. And if I would have interpreted it freely before this project, I would have probably thought of it as something that is quite a natural process with just time passing, cultures change, and things vanish. I think what the project has brought me when it comes to understanding this term is, it's brought just a ton of depth, obviously. But I think I'm often reminded of this quote, this kind of classical quote of history is written by the winners. But then I think that kind of perspective puts this binary sort of idea of there's a winner and then there's a loser. And I feel like throughout this working with this project, I've also come to understand that it's not always that binary because it indicates, okay, if there's, always the winner writing the narratives, then who is the loser? And I think it's just throughout the project, I feel like I've again and again sort of had a wake up call to the fact that I'm part of this culture and I'm an active participant in it.
Vida, I'd love to follow up with you on that. So, in the course of your conversations, was there something that helped you go from this very big abstract view into things that were more tangible?
I mean, it's all tangible in the sense that, throughout the series, every guest gave such tangible, kind of detailed and narrow, even examples of culture being passed from person to person, or how culture operates within a certain kind of scene or community. So, all of that has been very valuable. And I think it's both, I feel like I've both been zoomed out at the same time zoomed in to many things, and it's just widened and enlarged the understanding of the topic.
Yeah, I love that. We are all part of culture. Culture is part of all of us. Alice, I'd like to turn to you. So, full disclosure, we have worked together for 6+ years now on various things related to the Internet Archive, social campaigns. And so you came into the organization at a critical time for the Internet Archive. It was as the lawsuits in 2020 had just been launched, actually, the publisher's lawsuit. And so I was very familiar with your background as a campaign manager, especially on social media. And so I know that you've worked on campaigns and social engagement for quite some time. And I'm curious, what was it about this project that made you want to be involved?
Yeah, I think there's always been kind of a through line in a lot of the things that I've worked on that's about knowledge and information and who generates it and who owns it and how accessible is it to the public? What's the roles of kind of corporations or governments in distributing and owning and preserving information, whether that's from kind of working with people who face censorship to working on copyright and patent law around global health issues. So it's always been kind of something that I'm very interested in. I think one of the really interesting things about the vanishing culture topic in particular is so much of my work is often about trying to get people to care or notice. And I think with vanishing culture, actually, I think people already do notice and care. I hear my friends talking about all the time about kind of oh, this video game that I loved. When I was a kid, I can't find it anywhere. Or I was talking to my dad the other day and he was like, God, your mum's favorite Al Green album. It's not on Spotify. I can't find it anywhere. Or kind of, I was watching this thing on Netflix and it's moved and I can't access it anymore. And on the other end of the kind of, spectrum of severity of these examples, like trans friends being like, I can't find any information about people like me in this historical archive or whatever. So I do think actually, like, this is an interesting one for me because I think it's something that people already really care about and really notice and really feel the impact of.
Following up on that, so the dynamic with you and Vida, Vida was the host and the creator of the content, and you were the producer. So, with a producer hat on, like, was this a difficult topic for you to produce the conversation in a way that it was like, intelligible for people?
I think as a topic, the impacts are so diverse, right? And I think the sort of, as you can see in the series, the kinds of materials that are impacted, whether it's the marginalia in cookbooks is very distinct from, say, like what's going on there and the processes that are behind that kind of culture vanishing is very different to the processes behind what Brooke was talking about with this sort of vanishing or erasure of trans history. So there's a lot of very like interconnected issues, I think, that where the impacts are really vivid, but it can be a little bit difficult to see like how exactly do all these link up. And I feel like that was a journey for me, like producing it. It was a journey for Vida doing the interviews and talking to the people. We were both learning about that as we were creating the thing, which was really great.
One of the things I've really loved about this is I think, often when I think about some of these issues, I think about them at the like 30,000 foot level, where it's like, how do we deal with 500,000 books or, a million digital videos, especially when you think of online culture. And so one of the things I've loved about this is there's a person behind every single one of these artifacts, every single story, every single photograph, and not just the people who are depicted in them, but the people who are curating them and processing them and all of that. And so one thing I was curious about, Vida, this is to you as a musician and an artist. I wondered if there's like a particular story or interview in there that felt particularly personal to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I loved learning about all the different topics that were explored with the different guests. So it's been a thrill just to like witness the diversity in which culture expresses itself. So that's been really wonderful. But the one interview that I guess was mostly, let's say, in like my field or whatever, I would say was the one with Luca, because we did discuss a lot of things around music and sharing, and basically talking to Luca, I was just kind of mind blown a few times by what he shared, because I felt as though, of course, he's also the writer of the Vanishing Culture Report. So he's really read up on these things and he's very passionate about it. And that really came through in the interview. But there was also such a fresh and daring attitude underneath it all, I felt. And he basically just said like, "Well, why couldn't we just share everything for free?" Like, why couldn't we just be generous and trust each other that people won't steal and like make profit out of our content and whatever? Because we really live in an age in which we've been so conditioned to think the same way that the major platforms that now control our content wants us to think. And I'm certainly, I don't know, guilty of that. Or this is also something that's happened in the scene that I'm, I guess, associated with, which would be the music scene. And from very early on, we were learning about how to, make profit out of copyright. And none of it ever really made much sense to me. And it wasn't the part of music that I loved. And I don't think I mean, that was also a point that Luca made, that most musicians don't even know how it works. So they end up not making any profit out of, their recorded music anyway. And I'm certainly, I would say I'm one of those.
Alice, so you looked at the proposed topics, and you were part of the production of the Vanishing Culture book as well. So, like, we covered a wide variety of topics, right? So there were cookbooks, queer archives, African folklore, language preservation. That's a pretty big umbrella to talk about in terms of culture. So, did those topics feel connected, or did the common thread like only emerge and afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, it does sound pretty random, right? Like, what does, cookbooks have to do with folklore? But I think the thread really emerged, I think, as being about, okay, well, who writes cookbooks, right? And who uses cookbooks and who scribbles things in the margins of cookbooks and hands them down. And that, the answer is predominantly women because of the role that women have traditionally played in society and the home. So I think what really emerged as kind of the through line was, this idea that it's marginalized communities whose culture is at most risk of vanishing very often. And those are the communities who most often have their sort of own practices of sharing and preserving culture through kind of more community-based archives, but they're also the people with the fewest resources, right? And with potentially the most like physically, you know, degrading materials, right? Like queer communities are much more likely to be like making zines, which with low production costs that are gonna turn to pulp more quickly than something that is properly bound. And, women are much more likely to be writing in pencil in their cookbooks and everything. So there's a kind of relationship, I guess, between marginalized communities and these like added risks that make it more likely that culture will vanish and that, yeah, that sort of vanishing. It became very clear to me that the through line through these topics is that vanishing culture is very much an intersectional issue that kind of has a lot to do with all the different kinds of marginalization.
It also tracks because that's very consistent with the view that Luca has, that he's expressed in the writing and also in interviews afterwards, that vanishing culture really hits subcultures more than popular culture. Like Taylor Swift is going to persist, but queer, punk, small pressing, small run vinyl pressings, those are more at risk than Taylor Swift. And so, yeah, it's the subcultures that are really endangered.
Yeah, absolutely. On the other hand, like even Taylor Swift, I think we can't necessarily assume that in 200 years will be preserved because, you know, even Taylor Swift requires active preservation, right?
And then there's also the copyright interventions. You started talking about Al Green not being available on Spotify. We can rest assured, I don't know the answer, but I'm going to take a wild guess that it probably has something to do with copyright and licensing as to why that is not available. And those issues are going to be present in every musician's career.
Absolutely.
I'd like to ask both of you, looking back across all of the episodes, what was the most surprising thing that you learned through the process? Maybe start with Vida.
I'm not sure if I would say that I've necessarily felt surprised, but I felt, I think, quite shocked at times, if I can just use that word instead, by the extent to which things are disappearing and how oblivious I am to it, or how oblivious I've been, because hopefully now I've been enlightened.
How about for you, Alice?
I think definitely like an episode that for me gave me surprising ways of thinking about it was the episode with Peter Scholing about Papiamento. And I think something that I hadn't really like thought about before that made me think a lot was the way in which like often we think of preservation as that's for the future rather than that's for the present. And I think he was talking a lot about like the ways in which the sort of lack of preservation efforts around Papiamento really, really affect the way in which young Papiamento speakers now are able to use the internet. Because it means that all the kind of tools that as speakers of like more sort of dominant languages on the internet that we take for granted, those are not available to Papiamento speakers because, this is a more of a language with an oral tradition. A lot of the documents are like dispersed very widely because of the colonial context. And so there's just less digitized material for those tools to be working from. And I think that was kind of definitely like a moment for me where I was like, oh, I've been thinking, I do so much talking and writing copy and stuff about preserving for future generations. And it was surprising to me, I guess, to realize that that's maybe like a little bit of a blind spot for me, and that I hadn't been thinking about the current generation and how lack of preservation might affect their access to information and participation on the web.
Yeah, in a conversation that I had with Peter Schooling, I mean, he said it is not out of the realm of possibility to imagine digitizing everything that has ever been published or printed in Papiamento.
Wild. So I want to move on a little bit to talk about some of the themes across the series. And I'm really curious because you have been kind of doing this for a while and really deeply engaging with these different stories. And if you had to identify like one recurring tension across the series, what do you think it would be? This is to both of you, but maybe we'll start with Vida.
So, a recurring tension across the series. The ones that you mentioned, access versus ownership, community, platform, memory versus profit, they're all obviously relevant. The tension that I could feel across the series, there was a sense of an acuteness about the current moment. It really situated me in sort of the age that we are living in. And in this age, all of those things mentioned are, of course, at play. And I feel as though maybe it's also partly to do with the world that I exist in with music, etc. But I really think about platforms and sort of living in an age of platforms and what that means in terms of culture and how it's shared and how it's distributed and how, everyone's getting Amazon delivery rather than going to the record shop or whatever it might be, or the bookshop. It's a bit of a strange transitional age, but there's a lot of, pushback to this being our culture. We don't really want it, but it's like happening upon us, it feels as though. And I mean, it's like topics, of course, also like what's it called? The book by Yanis Varoufakis, the techno feudalism or whatever. That's a very sort of it's a very current topic that I feel like in a great way, like there's a lot of conversations around this these days.
I think so much of what we read and stuff like techno feudalism or like the work of Cory Doctorow is about how the platforms have convinced us that we can't leave and everything is about lock in. But it is kind of exciting to see this moment where people are embracing the idea that there's another pathway and they can sort of go their own route on their own systems that are much more interoperable and less platform dependent.
And may I add to that, actually? It's interesting because only I think it was about maybe a year ago now, but I had a friend who recently said, well, trying to find a way to quit Instagram, to quit social media in general. And that to me, when she said that, I was like, damn, I really want to do the same. And just that attitude, I think I was surprised by the fact that I felt as if that was a possibility, because I think a few years ago, maybe I wouldn't have understood the gravity of like the power with which social media kind of holds us captive or whatever. But now it's like there's this possibility of quitting. And I know artists who are really successful who've quit social media, who've quit Instagram and are still thriving. And so it's a very exciting time because I think a couple of years ago I wouldn't even have considered it, and maybe I also wouldn't have really understood why should I even quit social media. Like, yeah, I can limit my screen time, la la la. But now it's like, no, imagine what an interesting thing it would be to just quit.
Bringing what Vida's been saying back to the question, like what I really didn't see here was this like opposition or tension that I think like the corporations often want to kind of sell to us around. There's an opposition between creators and archives, or, creativity and ownership, that there will be no creativity, or creators won't be able to create or something unless we have really strict copyright measures that mean that libraries are not able to own work in the way that they need to archive. And I think that's so not what we saw here. What we saw, I think, was like so many like artists and creators and researchers and people doing really amazing creative work also doing really inspiring work around sort of finding like more community driven ways of like sharing and exploring different models for sort of distributing and preserving their work, and being really fed up actually of these more corporate models and really wanting to, yeah, like find the kinds of alternative ways that Vida's talking about doing it. So I think that, yeah, it was just really nice to see that there was actually no tension there in the way that the sort of like corporations discourse often kind of wants to frame it that way.
You've both mentioned here about the individuals and individual action. And so several guests challenged the idea that preservation should be left to large institutions alone. And so I'd be interested in your views, both of you, on what role do ordinary people play in cultural preservation?
Yeah, I think Brooke said so much really interesting stuff about this. I think that particularly like marginalized communities, the queer community, we kind of really need to be the custodians of our own culture in a way. And that there is, he was talking about just how much he asks people who know people within the community who trust him to be like, "Hey, my friend has this really interesting collection of photos. Do you wanna go take a look at it?" Or, "My friend was there when this really important thing happens. Do you wanna go and have a chat?" And, like, that kind of, I think, like, community building and community knowledge sharing, I think, requires individuals like Brooke, I think, who kind of steward it, but I think more than kind of the individual necessarily, I think like my takeaway was that it needs to be about collective community efforts to sort of address the gaps. Like, institutional archives will always have their own agendas, right? And those agendas will have blind spots. And I think even if things improve or shift, institutions will always have those blind spots. And I think it made me think a lot about the role of community and community archiving and filling those blind spots.
Can I add to that? Actually, thanks for reminding me of what Burke was saying on this, because I agree. It was particularly kind of illuminating because that interview really highlighted how it is the kind of DIY grassroots initiatives that eventually make their way into the institutions. You have to just persist. And I think the example Brooke used was the David Vojić archives, who now, like, everyone's obsessed with him. Everyone loves his work. But when he was alive, he died way too young of AIDS. He was a very much like a marginalized artist, poor, whatever. But he also made the most brilliant art that was fueled by his fury about the situations. And it's only a few decades later that his art and his work has become extremely popular. And he's like in a way more alive than ever.
So I'll tell you a little story. I was on vacation recently at a little cabin in Vermont that my grandparents built 50 years ago. And while I was sitting there, I found myself taking pictures of the guest book that they had in the house that dated back to 1972. It had an entry from when my mom met my dad, and it had a lot of personal family stuff. And then I'm going through the house and I'm snapping pictures of my grandmother's recipe book and all the notes of these interesting little recipes that she found from people in the mountains in Vermont. And in the back of my head is like vanishing culture. And I'm tracking all of this stuff. And so I guess it influenced me that way. But I had been wondering, after spending months working on this, has it changed any of your own habits, any of your own approaches to preserving things differently? And I guess I should direct that. Alice, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I've definitely been a lot more conscious about, like, I'm also a writer, and I've been a lot more conscious about not only keeping things in Google Docs and also trying to keep like more notes about process, like handwritten, and then taking photographs of them and things rather than relying. I think we put so much trust in these platforms that actually have only existed for decades, and we don't know what might happen to them in the future and don't even know what might happen to them tomorrow. And so, yeah, I've definitely been thinking a lot more about that. And yeah, I bought a CD on eBay of that Al Green. So I have it in my possession. So yeah, I think definitely been thinking a lot more about owning music in physical format. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. Vida?
Yeah, a couple of things. First thing is that Katie had this really great point about preserving her favorite recipes and starting her own archive with like recipes that she's learned or whatever to kind of avoid this things getting lost on the webs and the age of the food blog, etc. So I was very inspired by that. And I have started a list as well, but I think there's only like two things there. But I intend to keep this going all my life anyway. So I was inspired by that. And then I, because I do music, I think that I was already sort of, because I've already kind of been in this like DIY music scene of people doing cassettes and vinyls and all of that. Personally, I've not always been that excited about recorded. I mean, I am excited about recorded music, but I'm not so excited about recording music. I don't like the process, or like I don't like to fix things down. But I love playing music and performing. And I've started a choir here in London, and I've also led choirs in the past. And I think it's just sort of brought to my attention that the work that I do is important beyond just like, oh, we're singing together. And, there are many aspects of choir singing that's wonderful. It's good for your health, it's good for community, etc.
So when I was working with Luca and with Julia Ziskina, who also helped edit the essays and the work, the Vanishing Culture book, the three of us had a conversation about how we didn't want the work to be totally dark and depressing. And yet a lot of it was, because we're talking about cultural loss and we're talking about the loss of cherished items or of memories for individuals or for, culture as a whole. But in the conversation we've had here today, I haven't felt the two of you being like drawn down. I actually feel you kind of being like uplifted in the conversation. So I'd love to know, after hearing all of these stories, what gives you hope?
Yeah, I do think the community organizing that we're seeing around this, I found really heartening. Just, hearing Brooke talking about the work that he's been doing with his trans community, to Peter talking about the work that's being done to preserve Papiamento, obviously like very different contexts, but yeah, just so many community initiatives that are beginning, as Vida said, to make their way into more mainstream archives, and that kind of, those attitudes of the more institutional archives shifting as well, thanks to the community activism of these more marginalized groups that, like, it would have been unheard of like 50 years ago, maybe even 30, 20 years ago, to go and sit in the British Library and look through an archive of queer sex workers. And, you can do that now. And so there's, I think, the way in which the kind of that community activism is shifting the preservation priorities of the larger institutions, I think is really, felt really hopeful to me.
How about you, Vida? What gives you hope?
I would say that, well, in general, it's just to echo what you said. I haven't felt that the topic has been heavy for me. I felt like it was more heavy prior to diving into this topic because prior to it, it all just felt like, ugh, God, Spotify's taking over. Damn, like we're doomed kind of thing. That was the vibe. But now I feel like all the guests, they did such a brilliant job in sort of showing how what matters is that you're engaged and that you're passionate about something. And as long as you feel that way and you get active with the things you do, you are participating, you are contributing to preserving culture. Thank you so much for tuning in to this summer series on vanishing culture from the Future Knowledge podcast. Hope to see you again.